History doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. At least that's what I thought before researching this video. What I found is that often countries go through exactly the same destructive habits that others have also done before. In other words, history sure does repeat itself, and those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And on today's episode of Those Who Have Not Learned the History, it's America and why the empire is surely and irreversibly going to end. Because here's the myth that most people don't know. Empires don't explode, they slowly die out. We shouldn't wait for a 1945 moment of surrender. These things happen because of years and sometimes decades of pressure and change, normally with one main point to signify when it was public knowledge. And this speech by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, which I don't think is being discussed nearly enough, can be pinpointed as the time when it all officially went to decline.
For decades, countries like Canada prospered under what we called the rules-based international order. We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. This fiction was useful, and American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. We participated in the rituals, and we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works. Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition.
But to learn about how the American empire is collapsing, we first need to answer the question of what made American empire to begin with. The American empire was not like others before. It did not replicate the overseas territorial expansions that Europe underwent. Instead, it built a specialized global network that pulled power and influence away from regional powers and to them instead. American hegemony was built not just on its military dominance, but instead on three unique pillars. The first was its unprecedented material success, coming from the fact that it was not destroyed or even majorly harmed during World War II. America was the only major industrial power that emerged from World War II intact. It had 50% of the global industrial production, 70% of the global gold reserves, 57% of steel production, 80% of car production, and represented 61% of the combined GDP of the OECD. They had held the nuclear monopoly and had dominance of the world's oceans. It had, as its neighbours, weak countries and fish, and so could develop an enormous domestic market without conflict at home. Other war-torn countries like Japan, Germany, and Great Britain didn't have the ability to put up a fight. Whilst they had entire cities decimated, America's economy grew at 15% per year, and that made it rich in comparison. After all, military dominance was strictly a function of its economic surplus due to industrial output and tech. America was able to outproduce the Soviet Union and was able to contain it until it went bankrupt and collapsed. So America dictated the structure of the global economy around its own currency and legal preferences and built a global financial system. The Bretton Woods system, which was created in 1944, allowed the United States to peg the price of gold to the dollar, allowing the US to control global liquidity. It was a massive capture of power, with the Assistant Secretary of the US Treasury Harry Dexter White ensuring America got veto power over the global balance of payments. I won't delve too deep into the Bretton Woods system here, as I already covered it in this video, but just know that this agreement gave the United States insane leverage and control over the financial system. The dollar was often called an exorbitant privilege, with America ensuring that it became the global reserve currency. They could also become the lender of last resort, helping countries and regions out with financing if they wanted to, such as the Marshall Plan with Europe. This also allowed America to create dominating institutions, aka strategic binding, and our second pillar of American dominance. Following the lessons of the aftermath of World War I, the victors of World War II and especially America learned the lesson. They could have coerced the weakest states now, but instead they chose to give their choice and autonomy up and instead create unified institutions to help the war-torn nations build up and avoid another rerun of the 1930s. This also created the environment for American soft power to take hold, which is the ability to get preferred outcomes through attraction. The US projected values that were widely shared and attractive to others, such as freedom, democracy, and open markets. This created an enabling environment where other nations formulated preferences that aligned with US interests. However, the creation of NATO, the UN, the IMF, and the World Bank was not an act of charity, but domination. The US ensured that they were all headquartered in Washington, with the UN in New York, and that the voting structure was weighted to guarantee the US a permanent veto. They effectively got most of the world to give up their own autonomy for safety. War-torn Europe and Japan got funding as well as diplomatic and military support from the US, and all they had to do was acquiesce to the American sphere of influence. They also committed to ensuring free trade between countries and committed to keeping open sea lanes. America bought all major non-communist trading partners' loyalty and dollar-denominated trade with protection and economic growth. Keep that in mind. In reality, these institutions are all set up to spread American ideals and influence. Even today, examples range from countries like Bangladesh, Argentina, Ghana, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, and so many more. Country is struggling. Country needs funding. Country applies for a loan from the IMF or World Bank. Country has to impose crippling austerity to do so. Country ends up privatizing its national institutions, often to American companies, siphoning off profits from the country to the US, also whilst crippling the domestic base. The third pillar that made American power distinct was that it baked in global networks that acted as American checkpoints. It was invisible and efficient. By creating the world's plumbing, such as SWIFT and the internet cables, America could control the flow of information around the world. It could control who had access to global payments and even threaten to block them from it, crippling their economy. It could wiretap and listen into sensitive information in any country it wanted, thanks to ownership of the cables it laid down and the traffic it went through. By the early 2000s, 99% of all internet traffic passed through America, even if the companies were abroad, as America had all the data centers built up for this. An email from Brazil to Italy, or a bank transfer from Tokyo to Frankfurt would have to pass by a data center in Florida or Virginia, giving America the excuse to monitor its contents. One random town in Virginia, Ashburn, is nicknamed Data Center Alley due to the insane concentration of data centers and internet traffic there. The US also replaced the old colonial model of holding vast amounts of land with the more efficient islands and military bases in place like Guam, Diego Garcia, Hawaii, American Samoa, and even across the world in places like Germany, South Korea, Djibouti, Qatar, Turkey, Cameroon, and many other bases. That also includes as many bases as they want in Greenland. All in all, they number 800 bases across the world, allowing the biggest military in the world to deploy within minutes, not hours. This projected both fear and control across the world, both against its enemies and grey area countries, but even against its own allies. These pillars basically mean that anyone who wants to engage in the financial system has to play by the American rules. And it's not just to engage in the financial system, it's engage in its diplomatic vision of relations with your own region, far away from America, or even try to build their own country up. Everywhere you go, you will realistically not even come close to being independent, and if you are, it would be because America placed you there, and are therefore a close ally. There are other factors such as the amazing geography and military dominance, and so much more that we will get into and how they compare to other empires. Okay, now that we have the question of how America created its empire out of the way, we can analyze why empires fall and why it is happening to the US right now. The Roman Empire, the empire that spanned most of Europe and covered the Mediterranean, covering England, North Africa, Syria, Palestine, the Balkans, and everything in between. The Roman Empire, the ancient blueprint for Western dominance, didn't just vanish. Of course, there is rarely ever one reason that causes an empire to fall, but one of the main reasons that led to the decline of the Roman Empire is, funnily enough, bureaucracy. As the empire grew, it brought in a surplus of gold, grain, and slaves, which paid for the expansions. However, when it reached its geographical limits, it became clear that there was an increasingly high cost of maintaining the administration, military, information systems, and everyday functions. This is what is known as a declining marginal rate of return. Basically, as you add more of one thing, you get less and less of the other thing, until it's no longer even profitable or viable. Emperors like Diocletian doubled the size of the bureaucracy and the army to tighten control. This administrative bloat increased the burden on the peasantry. To bridge the fiscal gap, the state resorted to currency debasement. The silver content of the denarius collapsed from nearly 100% under Augustus to virtually 0% by the late 3rd century. A form of state fraud that destroyed the savings of the middle class and fueled hyperinflation. Eventually, the cost of the Roman Empire became so high and its own citizens were taxed and conscripted so much, the quality of life went down and the average citizen was so apathetic that in some cases they even welcomed barbarians to escape the doom of daily life. And they even saw an improvement in the standard of living in the transition to smaller, less complex states. The same is happening with the US. America is increasing its budget every year by a significant amount. I mean, it's responsible for almost half of all global military spending. Increasing budgets on military complexity, healthcare, and education are going to support private corporations and middlemen instead of helping the average person, just like it did with the Roman Empire. As complexity rises with bureaucracy or political gridlock and polarization, states become unable to solve major problems like rising national debt or crumbling infrastructure. Keeping with the Roman example, we see a general named Sulla who killed the late Roman Republic and transformed it into a dictatorship. It was by breaking political and domestic norms that Sulla was able to do that. For centuries, Roman legions were given absolute power outside of Italy. They developed brutal methods of suppression, surveillance, and execution in the provinces. But after Gaius Marius broke the unspoken rules and customs, Sulla threw the rulebook out of the window completely. He was the first to march legions into Rome and publish prescription lists of political enemies who were declared outlaws and were to be executed without trial. Those people were now stripped of their citizenship, and anyone in the streets could kill you and claim a cash reward. This wasn't a purge in the shadows, it was a bureaucratic process. It turned the citizens of Rome into bounty hunters against each other. It destroyed the fundamental trust required for a republic to function. By realizing that he could use the tools of foreign conquest at home to solve domestic and political issues, that taboo was broken. And every politician or emperor that followed him, such as Pompey, Crassus, or Caesar, realized that if you could not win by words, you could win by the sword, even against your own people. Imagine the tactics of invasion, intimidation, torture, and authoritarianism that the Americans used on other nations, such as in Nicaragua, Panama, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Vietnam, and in dozens of other countries in the last 70 years, or even in nations it supports, such as its greatest ally in the world. Even just the death of international law and norms that became apparent with the illegal invasion of Iraq. But at least there were strong defenders of international law at that time. I quote, "The use of force abroad, according to existing international laws, can only be sanctioned by the United Nations." Who was it that said that? The death of international law became too obvious to ignore. Once the US was supporting what so many human rights organizations call a genocide, this came to a climax with the kidnapping of President Maduro of Venezuela, when Trump didn't even try and hide the reason they kidnapped him. At least in the past, it was about human rights violations, weapons of mass destruction, freedom and democracy, crap like that which people outside the Western world knew was false, but at least the mask was still there. And it was there for a reason. Now they're just openly invading whoever they like. Once these tactics were shifted from being used on the third world to its own allies, such as the threats to invade Greenland, suddenly the Western world can see what an empire's final moments looks like. They can see it flailing around, not yet helplessly, but soon. Worse yet, now the same population of Americans who supported those actions are now facing those same tactics, just like a boomerang that has come home. It's actually called folk calls boomerang, or the Imperial boomerang. Tactics that the government develops to spread their imperialism abroad eventually come home and get used there. Just like the disgusting atrocities that were masked with reasonable sounding buzzwords to justify their brutal actions, so were the executions in Minneapolis. They tracked suspected terrorists abroad under the guise of national security, and now they turn around and use those same tools to spy on their own people. Military-grade equipment is decommissioned from use in Iraq and then sent to use in police forces across America to fight protesters. Soldiers returning from the Philippines brought the war-to-cure torture method home with them, and within years, police were using the exact same technique in police basements across the US. Surveillance technology like stingrays, originally developed to track terrorists in war zones, are now routinely used by local police to spy on petty criminals and peaceful protesters. The aerial surveillance drones that once patrolled the skies of Afghanistan to hunt insurgents are now being deployed by police agencies to monitor American cities. Even the French police chief who massacred 300 peaceful protesters in Paris was simply applying the ruthless colonial tactics he had perfected whilst occupying Algeria. Failing empires slowly turn from doing things for their people to doing it against them. And we can still yet see it with Congress, which is absolutely broken right now. Every norm and custom that allowed it to function well and support the country has been thrown out the window, and that's exactly what happened to the Ottoman Empire. Initially, its superb bureaucracy was what helped the Ottomans rule over 3 continents, but eventually it became a parasite that led to its destruction. The Janissaries, who were elite soldiers of the Sultan, began to become agents of the status quo. They became a hereditary class, and so were incentivized to keep things comfy for them. That led to them blocking reform to the military and government, even killing sultans that tried to push reform, like Selim III. They ensured the comfortable status quo remained, whilst Europe industrialized. It got so bad that Sultan Mahmud II had to slaughter his own bureaucratic and military arm in 1826 just to be able to pass a law. This all sounds far too familiar with what's happening in America right now. Elites are reaching the highest positions in society, after which they cement themselves with laws allowing for incumbency benefits and take bribes from lobbies to remain in power. The Ottomans tried to pass reform and centralize decision making, but all it did was lead to more bureaucracy, as everything now had to be approved by the central government in Constantinople. That was regardless of whether you were a farmer in Iraq or a merchant in the Balkans. Because it was so complex, the government auctioned off the right to collect taxes from farms to the highest bidder, which led to merchants buying those rights up and squeezing the farmers out of every last drop, which destroyed the economic base, as farmers couldn't afford to improve their land or buy new tools. This idea of elites destroying the state they run is not new. It's called elite overproduction, and it's not even the first time it happens in America's history or its Congress. During the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, the owners of factories raked in massive profits. In New York alone, the number of residents worth $100,000, or almost $4 million today, increased 7.4 times between 1828 and 1856. The number of law students also surged, which was the primary pathway into political office, whilst the number of congressional seats remained fixed. Competition for office became a zero-sum game, and elites fragmented along geographical lines, with the Northerners frustrated by the South's domination of the federal government, even though they were smaller in numbers. The Northerners created the Republican Party as a way to overthrow the established order. Political norms were broken, Democrats called Republicans traitors to the Constitution, whilst Republicans accused Southerners of treason. There were 125 incidents of violence on the floor of Congress between 1830 and 1860. That included stabbings and pistol pulling. And by the 1850s, many congressmen carried weapons. One senator noted, "The only persons who do not have a revolver and a knife are those who have two revolvers." This came to a climax in 1860 when the Republican nominee Abraham Lincoln won the presidency. The Southerners realized that they lost on the zero-sum game. They opted to secede from the Union, and the American Civil War erupted and almost killed America within a few years. All of this began from the massive influx of elites vying for a fixed set of institutional roles, leading to them becoming more disillusioned with the population and becoming more extreme and polarized. And this is what is happening right now. Seats for Congress are in more demand than ever. Everyone wants to be in Congress and other institutional roles, and so the price of winning a seat is increasing year on year, turning politics into a zone just for the ultra-wealthy. Elites who try and fail become bitter, and that creates instability, leading to figures like Donald Trump or Nigel Farage to come in, objectively members of the elite class, but who have to brand themselves as anti-elite or populist. Every cabinet is richer and richer, comprising of more billionaires and CEOs than the one before, with no sign of slowing down nor differentiating between Team Red or Team Blue. Elite overproduction leads to intense competition for political office and influence, stagnation of real wages, and a war between the elites that leads to the death of political compromise and social norms being followed. Political enemies are labeled traitors and treasonous. This has happened time and time again throughout history. It happened in France and was actually what led to the French Revolution and the chopping of heads. It happened in the Roman Republic, where dozens of up-and-coming elites with riches and private armies were vying for just 2 consul positions per year. They stopped playing by the rules, and we covered what happened there. It happened in 19th century China, where the Qing dynasty had 20,000 government jobs with over 3 million educated candidates competing for those roles. That led to the bloodiest civil war in human history, the Taiping Rebellion. That was led by a failed elite who failed the civil service exam 4 times, had a mental breakdown, declared himself the brother of Jesus Christ himself, and because he was educated, organized the peasants into a massive army which led to the deaths of over 30 million people across 14 years, and the effective death of the Qing dynasty. And worst of all, polarization in Congress has reached levels comparable to the 1850s, the decade preceding the Civil War. You know, the ones where they were walking around with pistols and knives in Congress. I cover everything about America's upcoming Civil War here. It's honestly just too obvious to not connect the dots, once you see what I've compiled here. One of the most defining moments in the demise of the old empires actually came after World War II. In 1956's Suez Crisis, Britain and France joined Egypt's noisy neighbour and tried to retake the Suez Canal from Egypt. However, they were pressured by the United States and even the Soviet Union to withdraw. Britain had been in an economic mess at the time, an insufficient oil supply, and even tried to get help from the IMF, which the US rejected because of this. The US even threatened to sell a significant amount of British bonds, devaluing the pound sterling and leading the country to be unable to import sufficient food and fuel. This is commonly cited as the moment when France and Britain had lost their superpower status, when the Americans and partially the Soviets forced them out of an incursion that they needed to have through economic coercion. In other words, a nation loses its autonomy and power status when it relies on foreign financing and support. And who is it that owns American debt? Most of it is in private hands, but it's incredibly unsustainable. The US is the richest empire right now. However, the richest empire often loses to the hungriest newcomer. It's the shift from making wealth to managing wealth that often catches it out. In the 1600s, the Dutch Republic was the warehouse of the world. They were the best producers and dominated. They built the best ships, produced the best clothes, and had great dominance in trade and industry. However, the Dutch realized that they could make more money by lending to foreign governments than by manufacturing, so it transitioned to a financial and services-based economy. Whilst that helped them become richer in the short term, it turned them into a rentier state as they deindustrialized. When the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War hit, the Dutch had plenty of gold but no industrial capacity to build a new fleet fast enough. Britain, which had focused on industrializing and production, crushed them and eventually took the title of the superpower. Funnily enough, that same scenario then happened to the British Empire, which produced almost a quarter of global manufacturing in 1880. And their dominance was toppled by the Germans and then by the Americans, which once again is now going through the same thing. They deindustrialized their economy and shipped manufacturing from towns and cities reliant on it, such as Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, that were the workshop of the world, to places in China, Vietnam, Thailand, and Southeast Asia. Just like Amsterdam became the financial hub, it moved to London and now it shares it with New York City. Whilst it provided a lot of high-paying jobs and economic stimulus, moving from a production-based economy to a purely services-based economy was a sign of decline. As at the end of the day, you need to have the capability and capacity to create the weapons, ammunition, and tools of war or daily life. If America and China were to ever get into a war, guess who has all of the supply chains embedded? Guess who has the highest industrial capacity? Have a guess where most of the rare earth minerals that are essential for all of our electronics are mined? And more importantly, guess who controls almost all of the refining? America at least still has a very strong military production sector, but that might not be going down a very great path. The Habsburgs in Spain were obsessed with war. They were fighting the Italians, the Ottomans, the North Africans, the Dutch, the Germans, and the French all at the same time in separate wars, and so squandered gold on it without developing the economic base. The same happened with the Soviets, who in a bid to win the arms race with America, spent far too much on their military and so struggled economically. Same with the Brits, who were caught up in a costly arms race with the Germans just before World War I, diverting money from industrialization and into building dreadnoughts. This may have not been a problem for the US 20 or 30 years ago, but as military spending is rising with national debt, it's going into unproductive avenues. I mean, it's spending $1 trillion a year on its militaries, more than the next 9 countries combined, 2 of whom are literally at war with each other, Russia and Ukraine, and several more are expecting to be in one and so are ramping up their spending. Meanwhile, the average American is struggling in so many different ways. Again, video about the impending American Civil War here. Interest on the loans is now the second highest cost at over $1 trillion every single year, just for the interest. As mentioned before, their spending is also seeing diminishing returns, such as in health, education, and R&D, which shows that it is really unsustainable and are in a downward spiral that they can't stop. Or else China will catch up. But China are already catching up with a far smaller budget. But at least America can band together with its allies and create a bloc around China, Russia, and other adversaries. Right? Well, not quite. Let's move over to the story of the Athenians. Athens, the strongest Greek city-state at the time. In a bid to strengthen the Greek city-states against the Persian Empire in 500 BC, Athens created the Delian League. It was pretty much the Greek NATO. An attack on one was an attack on all, and they all contribute money or ships to a common fund kept on the neutral island of Delos. Naturally, as Athens had the biggest navy, it acted like the protector. However, over time, Athens started using its power and leverage to push the other members around. 2080s after the creation of the Delian League, Athens moved the league's treasure from the neutral island of Delos to Athens. They had claimed that it was because they wanted to defend it, but in reality they actually used that money to build the Parthenon and fund their own golden age. So they claimed they wanted it for safety, even though there was no limitation on Athens regarding its safety, and it was just a power play. Sound familiar? Athens then forced its allies to stop minting their own money and start using Athenian silver coins, pretty much just like America and the dollar, stripping its allies off their sovereignty. And here's the worrying part: when allies like Naxos or Thasos tried to leave, Athens didn't let them. It destroyed their walls and seized their fleets. What started out as an alliance turned into an empire. Athens' former allies secretly turned towards what was once their enemy, Sparta, just to defeat the Athenians. Imagine how crazy that is. That would be like Denmark and Europe reaching out to China or Russia to help it defend Greenland against America. Crazy. Anyways, that kicked off the Peloponnesian War, a 27-year-long war that ended in the total destruction of the Athenian Empire. All of that just because Athens hijacked its position as the most powerful member of an alliance to get what it wants from its allies. I don't think I need to map out how similar of a situation we are in right now with America turning on its allies, which are a big reason in why it is such a dominant hegemon. When the small island of Melos asked to remain neutral, Athens slaughtered their men and enslaved the women, famously declaring, "The strong do what they can and the weak suffer." It's not surprising to hear that after that happened, the rest of the neutral Greek states joined with Sparta because Athens had no restraints. Alliances and agreements meant nothing. Athens also launched an unprecedented and unprovoked invasion of Sicily, but it was a massive failure. Much like the Iraq or Afghanistan invasions, the superpower wasted so much time and resources just to fail, leaving it unnecessarily weak and vulnerable. Sparta had the best soldiers, but no money for a navy. Persia, who if you will remember was the enemy at the start of the Greeks, saw this opportunity and gave Sparta massive amounts of gold to build a fleet, and it even led to lots of Athenian mercenaries defecting and joining Sparta. Athens had been so tyrannical to its allies that they defected and supported their former enemies in Sparta and Persia. The same thing happened with Napoleon, who tried to isolate Britain by blockade. All European allies, or those under his power, had to stop trading with the British, which destroyed the Dutch, Italian, Russian, German, and Portuguese economies. British goods were both better and cheaper, and the British Navy also retaliated by blocking all colonial goods from entering Europe. Once they realized how costly it was, the Russians and Portuguese broke the blockade. This led to Napoleon invading Portugal, which wasn't even part of the bloc, and still traded with Britain, occupying his own ally in Spain in the process. He replaced the Spanish king with his own brother, destroying all legitimacy. He had to station 300,000 soldiers in Spain, a supposedly friendly and allied nation, which bled him dry. It also led to him invading Russia, only to lose 500 out of his 600,000 soldiers to the cold and logistics. It was so costly and destructive that it set the stage for his collapse. His demise came not at the hands of the British, his enemies, but his own allies, at the Battle of Leipzig. The Soviets also did the same thing, pushed the idea of the Eastern Bloc as a way to support rebuilding and create a strong communist bloc, but in reality, it was a way for Russia to extract wealth from them. Once revolutions and protests from Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and other nations were violently crushed and sometimes invaded, it planted the seeds for animosity, which was one of the reasons that the Soviet Union fell. When America imposes sanctions on other trading partners such as Russia, Iran, or China, it puts them in a bad spot. It gets even worse when now they're being threatened with sanctions and tariffs, in one of the dumbest and most short-sighted moves an American can ever make. And now, countries are fighting back, not just hostile nations, but also supposedly allied ones, like South Korea, Japan, India, Canada, the UK, Brazil, and the EU, who are all looking away from the US because they can't be trusted anymore. And they're all looking towards America's biggest rival, China. US favorability from its two neighbors, Canada and Mexico, has drastically declined, the latter of which experienced a 32-point drop. The US experienced the steepest decline in the Brand Finance Global Soft Power Index amongst all 193 nation brands. People now trust America less than China. There were even calls for European countries like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, Germany, France, and the UK in England and Scotland to boycott the upcoming World Cup in the United States. A complete boycott if Trump were to invade Greenland. All because of this brain-dead man-child's erratic and disastrous choices. These are like 70% of the strongest teams available. I think it would have been so interesting as it would have completely fizzled this upcoming World Cup, which is undoubtedly associated with Trump. It will, in my opinion, be the worst World Cup, at least in my lifetime. But regardless, America, almost entirely thanks to Trump, has destroyed every special relation it has, which were all 75 years and hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars in the making. All thanks to one guy, who I just lost the count of how many times I have been speechless at what he has said or done. And it's this last one which I think is the most damaging, as what is a hegemon if you can no longer be the main influence on the global stage? What is the point? There are honestly so many more parallels I can highlight between empires of the past and the United States. I could spend all day listing more reasons and going deeper into each one. One such idea is that the global plumbing that America created, such as SWIFT or the USD, is being hijacked by America to push its own narrative. That will be a video in its own right because I just find it so interesting. It's also to keep this video from being too long. I know it was its own pillar, but I just want to dedicate a whole video to it because I just find it so interesting and fascinating, especially from the angle I want to come at it from. If you want to be alerted once that video drops, or you just found this video very interesting, make sure to subscribe. Now, it's important to point out that a lot of these problems predate Trump, or would have happened regardless of whoever is in power. It's simply the American system to blame, but we also can't ignore just how much this one brain-dead senile cult leader has managed to destroy every possible link of the system and every strength the US has been building for 75 years. If not 100 years, all gone in one. By using Liberation Day as a way to punish everybody else, instead of signing deals with China's neighbors and rivals like Biden did with India, Japan, and South Korea, he killed America's chance of creating an anti-China bloc. He gave China a golden opportunity, which it took. It turned around and created deals or hosted leaders from South Korea, Japan, Canada, the UK, India, and so many more major countries. By idiotically pushing for Greenland, for no reason apart from he personally wanted it. And also saying it was because he wasn't given the Nobel Peace Prize, which, ignoring the question of under what basis would he ever deserve it, Norway is both not involved with the independent Nobel Prize Commission, as well as the fact that Norway is different to Denmark, and therefore has nothing to do with Greenland. He also missed Greenland with Iceland so often that Iceland hired a Washington DC lobbyist for advice, as they were worried that he could accidentally invade them instead of Greenland. My god, you cannot make this up. International law has always been a scam, but there was at least some semblance of it, or at least a mask, and now it basically does not matter. That sentiment started off with the illegal Iraq and Afghanistan invasions, being done before the UN could allow it. It intensified as time went on and the operations expanded in those countries as well as previous operations in Chile, Somalia, Yemen, Guatemala, Libya, Cuba, and other countries. It led to the breaking point of genocide carried out by America's supposedly greatest ally for some reason. As people saw the bare hypocrisy laid out between the so-called liberal West and the atrocities they support. By invading Venezuela on clearly fraudulent grounds and not even doing the same shtick America normally does about democracy and human rights, instead just outright saying we are there for the oil. He once more gave Russia and China a free pass to do whatever they want. Might makes right now, for everyone. The former NATO Defense College had even stated that Trump's Greenland threats are a gift-wrapped present to Putin. Trump is also a massive accelerant of de-dollarization, one of the most important pillars of American hegemony. Ironically, by threatening countries that have tried to move away from the USD, he has accelerated the move away from the dollar. By freezing Russian assets and sanctioning countries like Iran, they are inadvertently creating new demand for an alternative. If the US not only has the power to coerce nations into doing what they want, but also exercises it in such a humiliating way, what idiot will stick around and not at least try and build their own system? It's like President LBJ said, the only power I've got is nuclear, and I'm not allowed to use it. You have so much power but can only use it once, because once it's used, you kill all the goodwill you had before. Saudi Arabia sold oil to China in the RMB for the first time ever, and confidence is dropping. And now, both countries and banks are rushing over to swap their dollars for gold to escape the blackout. That being on the wrong side of the system can make you, as well as decreasing trust in the US government. By 2025, 96% of central bank reserve managers surveyed cited geopolitics and US policy as a major risk. And 95% of surveyed central banks expected increases of gold reserves, driven explicitly by de-dollarization and hedging against US sanctions leverage. And that's massive. Having the reserve currency is what allows the US to drive massive deficits, control global payments, wield sanctions, and so much more. The CBO estimates that the reserve currency premium that the USD gives to the US allows them to have 22% more debt than a non-reserve currency would, which is around $7 trillion in today's $39 trillion debt pile, by the way. He's intensely accelerating the partisan divide between Republicans and Democrats, which is such a strong indicator of internal collapse and potentially civil war. I mean, he didn't invite two governors to the annual governors meeting because they were Democrats. He's also withheld aid from Democrat states, as well as unleashing ICE on Democratic cities, just because they're Democrats. That includes not just deporting American citizens because of their skin color or heritage, not keeping children in cages as America's always done, but also murdering 2 US citizens and then gaslighting the entire country who saw the video with their very eyes from multiple angles and ended up calling them domestic terrorists. There's like 10,000 more examples I could give of Trump targeting Democrats because they're Democrats. I would add another 3 hours to this video if I mentioned every illegal and unconstitutional thing that ICE has done, let alone Trump. Just Google ICE or Trump and unconstitutional and enjoy. He's thrown every single political norm out the window and set it on fire, like renaming everything under the sun after himself or building a massive $500 million ballroom whilst the people of America starve. His daily lies using made-up figures which are just so tiring, or constantly blaming the Democrats for everything and taking credit for things which either didn't happen or did but he had no relation to, and Rome rotted from within. Once more, a lot of us think that Europe or America are always going to be superpowers. There's no reason that should be the case. Empires decline when their economic base shrinks relative to their military and strategic budgets. Their rivals grow much quicker than them, which causes a dividing point for the hegemon, cut its commitments and risk the collapse of the order it built, or fund military consumption by diverting an increasing share of national wealth away from productive investment. British historian Niall Ferguson notes that imperial decline often begins with a debt explosion, and, well, I would say they're at least trying to give us bread and circuses to distract us, but the bread is filled with microplastics and 1 billion ingredients, and the circuses have like quintupled in price to $150 a month. This all feels inevitable. Not just inevitable, but underway irreversibly. The worry here is relative decline, not just whether or not the US is going to grow, but whether its rivals such as China will outgrow it. The only question is, how will the US react? Because in the last 500 years, there have been 16 cases where a major nation's rise disrupted the position of the dominant state. That's known as a Thucydides trap. And out of those 16 cases, have a guess how many did not result in war? 4. That means that 12 cases resulted in war, most notably between the dominant British Empire and the rising Germany in World War I, and later in World War II. Don't forget that China and America have much larger armies, navies, and have nuclear weapons. According to political scientist Joseph S. Nye Jr., sooner or later, if present trends continue, war is probable in Asia. China today is actively seeking to scare the United States away from East Asia, just as Germany sought to frighten Britain before World War I. Similarly, columnist Robert Kagan claims the Chinese leadership views the world in much the same way Kaiser Wilhelm II did a century ago. Chinese leaders chafe at the constraints on them and worry that they must change the rules of the international system before the international system changes them. University of Chicago political scientist John Mearsheimer asserts, to put it bluntly, China cannot rise peacefully.
Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. But more recently, great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination. The multilateral institutions on which the middle powers have relied, the WTO, the UN, the COP, the architecture, the very architecture of collective problem solving are under threat. And as a result, many countries are drawing the same conclusions, that they must develop greater strategic autonomy in energy, food, critical minerals, in finance and supply chains. When the rules no longer protect you, you must protect yourself. And there's another truth. If great powers abandon even the pretense of rules and values for the unhindered pursuit of their power and interests, the gains from transactionalism will become harder to replicate. Hegemons cannot continually monetize their relationships. Allies will diversify to hedge against uncertainty. They'll buy insurance, increase options in order to rebuild sovereignty. Sovereignty that was once grounded in rules but will increasingly be anchored in the ability to withstand pressure.
This video covered how the American empire is crumbling abroad. To find out how America went from the richest and most powerful nation in history to one which is collapsing on all sides internally, how it went from an up-and-coming utopia to a modern-day dystopia, watch this video.